So, hello, Peter, and hello, Witold. I'm very glad to see you here in St. Petersburg, but not exactly here in St. Petersburg, but you know, in video translation. And so today we have the presentation of the last issue of our journal, Horizon Studies in Phenomenology. And I would like to thank you very much for deciding to participate in our presentation. And a few words about this special issue. The special issue titled Traditions and Perspectives of the Phenomenological Movement in Central and Eastern Europe. And last year in June, in the Institute of Philosophy of the Research Center for the Humanities of the Hungarian Academy of Sciences was held a conference titled Horizons Beyond Borders, Traditions and Perspectives of the Phenomenological Movement in Central and Eastern Europe. And Peter, Andras, Varga and Witold Plotka were the organizers of this conference. So the main idea of the conference was to explore the place of phenomenology in contemporary philosophy in Central and Eastern Europe. So we know it has long been understood that the circumstances of their phenomenological movement in this part of the world were dramatically defined by the politics of the times. The generally hostile conditions for doing philosophy affected phenomenologists specifically, insofar as it was officially regarded as an idealistic, bourgeois and regressive philosophy. And also we know that many philosophers of that time were completely isolated, and phenomenology in this part of Europe, I mean the central and eastern part of Europe, has developed in a steady dialogue beyond national borders and ideological boundaries. So it was also in Russia. But now we know such leading figures of the phenomenological movement as Alexandru Dragomir, Roman Ingarden, Josef Tischner, Karl Wojtyla, and many, many others. About them we will speak today. So the full potential of the phenomenology constitutes a rich heritage that continues to define our contemporary philosophical horizons. The aim of the conference was to present scholars with a first-time opportunity to discuss the wide and rich range of phenomenological ideas that have been discovered in Central and Eastern Europe. And after the conference, we have decided to prepare this thematic issue of our journal, Horizon Studies in Phenomenology, based on the conference proceedings. So here is the result. And I should also say that the first presentation of this issue was in Gdańsk 2 months ago. It was a conference, the second conference, Phenomenology and Practice, the second conference on traditions and perspectives of the phenomenological movement in Central and Eastern Europe, and Witold Plotka organized this conference. And there, so I would like to thank Witold especially for the first presentation of this special issue in Gdańsk 2 months ago. And it was really very nice and inspiring meeting. And so today in St. Petersburg, it is the second presentation of the special issue. So once again, the first was in Gdańsk, and once again, thank you to Witold for this opportunity. And so you see that, so the first conference dedicated to the phenomenological movement in Central and Eastern Europe was last year in Budapest, and this year in Gdańsk, and perhaps Witold, next year it will help hopefully, yes, in Riga. So it will be continued. I should say that in Budapest it was a very large scale conference, so more than 60 participants, yes, from different parts of the world, not only from the Central and Eastern Europe, but from different parts of the world. And it was really an exciting meeting. I know how it is difficult to organize a good conference, and so how much effort it takes. And the conference was perfect, and in Budapest and Gdańsk also. So many thanks to once again to Peter and Witold. And while preparing this thematic issue, we were in contact with Peter and Witold, because Peter and Witold are the co-editors of this special issue. And I would like to express my thanks to our co-editors, to Witold and Peter once again. It was really a pleasure for me as well as for our editorial board to cooperate with them and to make this, to prepare this special issue, and it was really cooperation in a very friendly and professional manner. So I'm very much looking forward to continue our cooperation. And now, so once again, thank you for deciding to participate in our online event. And I think we can open our presentation with the first paper, and I give Witold the floor. So Witold, please, you will be the first, if you are not against this order, so you will be the first. Witold, please.
No. Thank you, Natalia, for this introduction, and let me say only a few words about the publication. It was indeed a great pleasure and honor to be a co-editor with Peter of this special issue. I think it's very important to promote Central and Eastern European phenomenology, and I hope that we'll organize also this third conference. And of course, I want to thank you, Natalia, for great work, for your support, and for publication of this volume. And as you can see, my paper is connected to Central European phenomenology. I will give a short talk on early phenomenology in Poland. I want to indicate main trends, problems, and key figures. So, introduction. Phenomenology in Poland has a long tradition. This fact has been highlighted by the recent publication of two important books. Here you can have the front covers of the books, namely a bibliography of Polish works related to Husserl, and a collection of selected articles connected to or using phenomenology and published in the pre-war period. Both works show that the very first Polish thinker to refer to Husserl was Władysław Heinig, who already published his review of his Philosophie der Arithmetik in German in 1895. In turn, the first text on Husserl in Polish was published in 1904 by Łukasiewicz, a prominent member of the Lwów-Warsaw School. These basic facts are, however, not very well known. Even more, the contributions of early Polish phenomenology to and its influence on contemporary philosophy has been rather unexplored, and they are usually reduced to Roman Ingarden's philosophy. This paper aims to provide an introduction to the context, main figures, and text of the phenomenological movement in Poland in the period of 1895-1945. By this period, I understand early phenomenology in Poland. In doing so, the paper also attempts to present the main trends of early Polish phenomenology, and on this basis, to formulate a diagnosis of the pre-war phenomenological movement in Poland. A further aim of this paper is to give a description of phenomenology in Poland as a pluralistic movement that can, of course, be regarded as having centers, for example, figures such as Ingarden, but also peripheries, which deepen our understanding of what phenomenology was and can be. The phenomenon of phenomenology in Poland is indeed rich and complex. It was shaped in and through a lively dialogue, and this included a critical confrontation with the Lwów-Warsaw School. At the same time, the scope of phenomenology in Poland is irreducible to academic philosophy or to the single discipline of philosophy. To the contrary, phenomenology has also been present, even prominent, in artistic, psychological, and sociological circles. Even more, Due to his historical circumstances, phenomenology was engaged in political contexts. Thus, the question of phenomenology in Poland is a question of different areas of interest, periods, topics, and focuses. The first part of my paper, First Reactions, 1895-1918. Although Husserl's early work, Philosophie der Arithmetik, published in 1891, is usually regarded as a pre-phenomenological work that develops an account of the concept of number, based mainly and mostly on descriptive psychology, it does contain some ideas that led to the laying of a foundation of a major form of phenomenology. Reacting constructively to criticism, soon resolved to overcome the psychologism of this work. In this connection, his Logische Untersuchungen seems to be a breakthrough work, because here Husserl formulated the main arguments against psychologism in logic and laid a methodological basis for phenomenology. This widely discussed work made its author famous, and it opened for him the path to a professional position at the University of Göttingen. In Poland, both works of Husserl aroused serious academic interest. Heinrich published his critical and polemical review of Husserl's Philosophie der Arithmetik in the Zeitschrift für wissenschaftliche Philosophie in 1895. Earlier, he had studied in Zurich and Munich and written his dissertation under Richard Avenarius. He wrote the review in Vienna. After his return to Poland, he worked at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow. In the review, Heinrich focused on methodological issues. In his view, one can investigate concepts in a twofold manner, namely, either by bringing their different layers of development to clear insight. He uses a German phrase, klare Einsicht, into their value and scope, or by describing their present stage of development. There is no evidence that Husserl even took notice of Heinrich's review. Indeed, the secondary literature pays much more attention to Husserl's reaction to the famous review of Gottlob Frege. Although it seems that Heinrich did not influence him, it may not be an exaggeration to say that Husserl's early thought was shaped by another Pole, Kazimierz Twardowski. It is well known that Twardowski's influence on Polish philosophy is pervasive. He is commonly regarded as the founder of the Lwów-Warsaw School of Logic. Like Husserl, Twardowski studied philosophy in Vienna under Franz Brentano. Unlike him, however, he completed his dissertation under Robert von Zimmermann. Twardowski influenced Husserl in regard to the theory of acts and, as a result, in regard to the critique of psychologism. In his early work zur Lehre von Inhalt und Gegenstand der Vorstellungen, Twardowski argues that an immanent phenomenon, such as a mental act, must be regarded as involving three elements: content, object, and presentation. The object is irreducible to the act, but the act refers to its object by virtue of its content. Husserl discussed this theory while working on the theory of intentional objects and his critique of psychologism, and moreover, he reviewed Twardowski's work. Twardowski had a strong influence on phenomenology in Poland. For example, he encouraged his Lwów students, including in Garden, Bronisław Bandrowski. You can read something more about those students on the slide. Bronisław Bandrowski, Stefan Błachowski, and Kazimierz Ajdukiewicz to study philosophy in Göttingen. Another student of his, Stanisław Leśniewski, who is known for the construction of the three-nested formal systems, regarded Husserl's philosophy as one of the sources of his own view of philosophy. Yet, it was Łukasiewicz, a student of Twardowski, a logician and an interpreter of Aristotle's syllogistic, who published the first work on Husserl in Polish. In a short note, he summarized Husserl's arguments against psychologism, pointing out that psychological laws are only probable, whereas logical laws are reliable. It is worth noting that the first Polish student of Husserl in Göttingen was Alexander Rosenblum-Augustowski, who began his studies under Heinrich at the Jagiellonian University in Krakow in 1902. He moved to Göttingen in 1905, where he studied for 10 semesters. Rosenblum was a co-founder of the Göttinger Philosophische Gesellschaft. In 1907, he participated in Husserl's seminars, but also in Reinach's classes. Rosenblum was interested mainly in the question of the phenomenological method. Later, he cooperated with the Munich Circle. In 1908, he presented in Reinach's seminar a talk on Łukasiewicz, Analysis and Constitution of the Concept. This was the title of the paper. In his correspondence, Husserl mentions Rosenblum a few times. Rosenblum was a very active member of the Göttingen and Munich circles, though he did not publish any text. By the way, for this reason that he was very active, but he didn't publish anything, for many people, he is comparable to Johannes Daubert, so Polish Johannes Daubert, so to speak. So, though the period 1895-1918 was the beginning of the phenomenological movement in general, phenomenology resonated in Polish academic life in many respects. Ingarden reviewed the second edition of Husserl's logical investigations. Rosenblum attempted to translate the work, but he eventually abandoned the project. In addition, Konstanty Michalski and Joachim Mettelmann, you can read more on the slide about those two philosophers, refer to some elements of Husserl's theory of knowledge. During this period, Polish thinkers tried not only to define basic concepts and method of phenomenology, or to establish first polemics, but also, and first of all, they tried to use phenomenology as a methodological tool. At this point, phenomenology encountered its first critic in Poland. One, it was accused of using difficult technical vocabulary, and as a result of beginning a vague philosophy. Two, its critique of the sciences was regarded as misguided because sciences simply are successful. And three, finally, its arguments were judged inconclusive and lacking in impact on psychology. Thus, the first reactions to phenomenology in Poland encompass not only commentaries on many aspects of phenomenological philosophy, but also a constructive critique of it. The second part of my talk, the Lvov Circle, 1919-1945. The second phase of the development of phenomenology in Poland seems to have a central figure, namely Ingarden, and it is strong connected to his teaching activities at Lvov University. Ingarden earned his doctorate with a dissertation of Bergson under Husserl at the University of Freiburg in 1918. After World War I, he returned to Poland, and already in 1919 he published an important two-part study entitled The Phenomenologist's Aims. This pair of articles presents a comparative historical and systematic study of the main topics of phenomenology, including Husserl's early psychologism in his Philosophie der Arithmetik, the critique of psychologism in logic, the phenomenological requirement to limit analysis to direct experience, the descriptive manner of investigations, the a priori basis of the analysis of essences, and a transcendental reformulation of phenomenology by the methodological method of reduction that omits the petitio principii problem. For Ingarden, the aims of the phenomenologists ultimately involve systematic and rigorous descriptions of the different fields of object, and as a result, the formulation of a formal and material ontology. Though the two articles did not raise the realist-idealist controversy directly, they include several pivotal issues that later defined Ingarden's critique of Husserl. For example, the question of the ontological neutrality of the reduction. As is well known, Ingarden changed transcendental phenomenology with being a philosophy that leads toward metaphysical idealism. In any case, Ingarden emerged as a key figure of this period, both as a proponent and as a critic of phenomenology. After his return from Germany, Ingarden worked as a teacher in the secondary school in Torun, and later, starting from 1925 on, as a docent at Lvov University. Although Husserl interceded on his behalf to help him obtain a full position in Lvov at that time, it was only in 1933 that Ingarden was given a chair. In the 1920s, Ingarden attempted to translate Husserl's logical investigations into Polish, but the project did not meet with a favorable response from publishers. In the 1930s, Ingarden was already an internationally recognized scholar on the basis of his authorship of the literary work of art, Das literarische Kunstwerk, published in 1931. In Lvov, by contrast, he felt himself a solitary phenomenological researcher because logic was still the dominant discipline of philosophy. In spite of this circumstance, he eventually established a group of talented scholars and researchers who were not necessarily his direct students, which developed phenomenology in new directions. As a result, the Lvov circle of phenomenologists include psychologists, philosophers, and aestheticians. For example, Salomon Igel, you can read more on the slide, Walter Auerbacher, Tadeusz Witwicki, Zofia Lisa, who published one of the first analyses of the phenomenon of cinema, movie, and the last one, Leopold Blaustein. It is worth noting that Blaustein is the author of the first monograph in Polish on Husserl's phenomenology, published in 1928. It was Husserl's theory of the act, content, and the object of the presentation. The book is a critical elaboration of Husserl's theory of act consciousness. Blaustein accepts Husserl's method of eidetic description, but he rejects the requirement that one reduces within phenomenology the history of philosophy. Although he is critical of Husserl's method, he describes consciousness in terms of an international act that, following Husserl and Twardowski, contains both a presentational content and the object of a presentation. According to Blaustein, Husserl did not differentiate consistently between experience and experiencing, and for this reason he cannot distinguish an experience sensation from the act of sensation. As a result, experience data are reduced to immanent experiences, and thus to object to consciousness. In Ingarden's view, Blaustein is not clear enough on this, because Husserl did not indeed differentiate between experience data and aspects, Abschattungen, of objects. If that is the case, then Husserl also distinguished consistently between the objective and the subjective aspects of experience. The publication of Ingarden's Das literarische Kunstwerk was the beginning of the reception of phenomenology in aesthetics, for example, Hwistek, Kroński, Blaustein, as well as in artistic circles. In this connection, Blaustein presented original but polemical studies on imaginative representations in art and on the cinema. In addition, the Polish avant-garde painter, writer, and philosopher Stanisław Ignacy Witkiewicz criticized Husserl's philosophy for being an abstract and static theory of consciousness. In his view, Husserl's major error was the reduction of the lived body. The transcendental ego, he argued, is an ephemeral ghost. Let me pass over to the conclusion. Early phenomenology in Poland developed as a reaction to the first phenomenological works published in Germany. The reception of Husserl's philosophy began in 1895, but the Munich Circle was also a popular point of reference. Of course, the reception was not passive but critical, and in turn it influenced Husserl. Phenomenology in Poland flourished as a pluralistic field of research that encompassed many distinct but intertwined topics and disciplines. Polish phenomenologists discussed classical issues of phenomenology, such as the structure of the act of consciousness, the possibility of method of reduction, and the question of psychologism. So, in some epistemology, so here we can indicate Rosenblum, Mettelmann, Ingarden, Blaustein, and of course, Witkiewicz. In this connection, one can identify multiple formulations of phenomenology as descriptive psychology or as a transcendental philosophy. Phenomenology was used or discussed with regard to epistemology, ontology, so Ingarden, Krzemicka, Kroński, and Witkiewicz, logic and semantics, Ajdukiewicz, Leśniewski, Hwistek as well, aesthetics, Ingarden, Hwistek, Lisa, Blaustein, Kroński, and social philosophy, Znamirowski and Bautro. Znamirowski developed Reiner's theory of acts, social acts. In the end, however, early phenomenology in Poland seems to have been shaped by two leading thinkers, namely Twardowski and Ingarden. Although he was not a phenomenologist at all, Twardowski inspired and defined Polish phenomenology as focused on the question of psychologism and that of the relationship between act, content, and object. A direct but critical student of Husserl, Ingarden merged and melded basic phenomenological terminology and Polish philosophical vocabulary, and determined the later reception of phenomenology in Poland, as concentrated on the realist-idealist controversy. Briefly, Ingarden taught phenomenology how to speak Polish. During the early period, however, there was no Polish, so to speak, Polish school of phenomenologists. parallel to, for instance, the Warsaw School. Yet, as this paper shows, I believe so, the collective contributions of the early Polish phenomenologists constitute an excellent enchantment of the invaluable heritage of Polish philosophy. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Witold, for your very interesting paper. And now questions or reaction? Some questions? So perhaps from me will be the first question, just very general question. What reaction met in Poland to the Husserl's transcendental, so-called transcendental turn? So in other words, which reaction met Husserl's the first book of ideas? Because for example, for the Russian phenomenology and for the history of Russian phenomenology, it was the start point, so to say. So the first book of ideas, and the first reaction was by Gustav Speth, as I've told also during this conference in Gdańsk in September. So the question about the reaction in Poland on this transcendental turn.
Yeah. Thank you for this question. That's a very interesting issue, to be honest. So, as I said during the presentation, during my talk, Polish phenomenologists were focused mainly on the logical investigations. And not only phenomenologists, as Rosenblum and Ingarden, but also logicians, as, for example, Leśniewski. Leśniewski even wanted to translate it into Polish, because it was regarded as one of the fundamental works, but later he abandoned the project and he decided only to support other efforts to translate this work. But Ideas 1, this book, I think it was completely absent. It was regarded as the idealistic turn in Husserl, and for this reason, many philosophers simply abandon justification of the turn, of the idealistic turn in Husserl. So they simply, I think they skip the book. Of course, Ingarden's reception is important in this context, because when he published the review of the logical investigations, the second volume, the second edition of the logical investigations, so published in the same year as Ideas 1, he refers to Ideas 1 as one of the possible ways going out from the problematic field of the logical investigations, namely towards a transcendental sphere of investigations. But in this sense, in the review from 1915, transcendental turn still is regarded as mainly epistemological turn, but later, starting, I don't know exactly the day, but it started in the 20s, it was regarded as idealistic philosophy, in a sense of metaphysical philosophy in general. And at the end of the 30s, there are many articles, I didn't refer to them, there are many articles published in Polish dedicated to Husserl that criticized Husserl for falling into idealism, metaphysical idealism. So at the beginning, so starting from 1913, only the second edition of the logical investigation was reviewed. And as far as I know, there was no review of Ideas 1. Nonetheless, Ingarden and another important author to whom I take note refer, Władysław Tatarkiewicz, they refer to Ideas 1, but they did not criticize at that time. But starting from the 20s, and it was obvious in the 30s, Ideas 1 is idealistic work. So for this reason, one has to be very suspicious of the idealistic consequences of Husserl's argumentation. So it was complicated in one word.
Thank you very much for this detailed answer, Witold. One more question, perhaps, already? Okay, perhaps later we can put questions after all reports. Thank you, Witold, once again for your very interesting paper. And now I would like to give the floor to Peter. Peter?
Thank you, and good afternoon. I think it started the show. Okay, thank you again. And so first of all, I would like to say thank you for all the participants of the conference in summer 2015. Also to those who submitted their papers to the special issue of the Horizons, Studies in Phenomenology. And last but not least, to Natálya Артёменко personally, editor-in-chief of this journal, for putting together this excellent issue. And it was really a pleasure for me to work together with you and with Witold in this regard. And I hope that this conference and this journal issue could have contributed to strengthen the cooperation between us phenomenologists in this region. So maybe it's just better to speak this way. Can you hear me better? Okay. So I was asked to speak about a topic that was in the center of interest of the conference and also of the journal issue, namely writing the regional history of phenomenology in Central and Eastern Europe. And I will do it from the point of view of my main research interest, namely that is early phenomenology, and my regional affiliation, that is Hungarian, in the hope of being able to contribute some insights to our shared discussion. So, just a technical remark. Okay, so the slides are working, but you can also find my slides at the academia.edu page. So, first, I would like to delineate a notion of early phenomenology that will be used during my presentation. It's a bit different from the one used by Witold, maybe. Then I present two case studies on the regional historiography of early phenomenology and try to draw some lessons they could teach us in this regard. Finally, I would shortly speak about some other functions of this, which must be mentioned as well. And just one important thing to begin with. This talk is a contribution or insights based on ongoing research, both my research project in early phenomenology and other research projects at our institute, which aim at creating digital archives of the history of Hungarian philosophy. So this is not these are insights or comments, suggestions, but it's not a systematic exposition of the history of early phenomenology in Hungary. You can find an excellent short survey in an article by Professor Mezei in the Encyclopedia of Phenomenology, published by Kluwer. But so at the same time, I think there is still a lot of new work to be done on this subject. So this is why it's not a systematic exposition, but rather some new results, so to speak. So first, early phenomenology, the way I understand it, is an umbrella term for the school of Brentano, the Munich and Göttingen phases of the phenomenological movement, the early Freiburg phase of the phenomenological movement. So it means that for the present purposes, early phenomenology ends somewhere around the First World War, the years of crisis, 17, 18, 19, 20. So it was at least radically transformed and by that time. Just one short remark. So early phenomenology was not a creatio ex nihilo by Brentano, but rather, at least I believe, it was deeply rooted in both the 19th century German academic philosophy, the so-called Universitätsphilosophy, as well as Austrian philosophy of that time, which was merely Herbartianism, including the transmission, the Herbartian transmission of Bolzano, for example, by Robert Zimmermann. Okay. And then, so from this point of view, there are already some relevant aspects of early phenomenology. Namely, early phenomenology itself was a process of cultural transmission between the southern and the northern parts of the German language and cultural area. So it somehow moves from Austria and South Germany to North. And from this point of view, at least from the point of view of the Hungarian story, we were closely integrated to this area because of the Habsburg Empire, what at the time was called Austria-Hungarian Empire, and it was a constitutional so connection between the two countries. And I think that drawing a line around the end of the Great War is also useful for the purposes of this regional history, because all region was transformed drastically by the end of the war. This is obvious. So, so from this point of view, then the question arises: did this geographical and cultural proximity led to a contact between Hungarian philosophers and the school of Brentano, or Brentano himself? University studies abroad, the so-called peregrinatio, is a well understood and much studied historical phenomenon, and Vienna was a common destination given its geographical proximity and the aforementioned cultural ties. Some years ago, I did an high-level study in Vienna looking for Hungarians studying at Brentano. To make a long story short, there were, of course, many Hungarian students of Brentano, but none of them made a high-profile career in philosophy. Respectively, interesting figures simply missed Brentano due to contingent reasons. The most painful missed opportunity, by the way, was that of Bernard Alexander, who would later become the most influential professor of philosophy around the turn of the century in Hungary. He had studied in Vienna just before Brentano arrived in 1874. Alexander had close ties to the Herbartian professor Robert Zimmermann, who in turn had been a personal disciple of Bolzano earlier in Prague. And Alexander was really visiting the classes of Zimmermann and having conversations with him, and Zimmermann helped him to publish his first papers, for example, Vienna Dailies. But then in 71, Alexander became dissatisfied with what Austrian philosophy could offer to him and moved to Berlin. And this is a tragic episode insofar as in Berlin, he suddenly became attracted to neo-Kantianism, so under the guidance of Benno Erdmann and the big professor Friedrich Pausen. So one might say that had Alexander encountered Brentano in Vienna before moving to Berlin, he could easily have been attracted to early phenomenology instead. So this is a big historical counterfactual at the beginning of the Hungarian reception of early phenomenology. Okay, and then, so obviously there was a reception, but it was one generation later. Namely, it consisted in mostly students of Alexander, younger students of Alexander, their network, and the one who had the deepest contact with Brentano himself, it is less known, was Géza Révész. By the way, he was actually the son-in-law of Alexander, and you can see a photo of the daughter of Alexander. So Révész first studied in Munich, Berlin, and Göttingen, and he obtained his doctoral degree in Göttingen, but not under Husserl, but under Georg Elias Müller. When he went back to Hungary, however, he developed a rich correspondence with Brentano, which lasted until the death of Brentano. It's really a rich correspondence, but it's still not published. And Brentano even tried to secure a professorship to Reves either in Innsbruck or in Prague. Later, Reves was more or less forced to leave the country in 20, and he became a professor of psychology in Amsterdam. It's also interesting to note, from the point of view of this question of proximity, that it was in Italy, rather than in the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, where Ákos Pauler, who later became the most influential interwar teacher of philosophy. So Ákos Pauler encountered Brentano, both in the sense of encountering Brentano's ideas at a psychological congress in 1904, and in the sense of encountering Brentano personally in 10 in Florence. So one could say that cultural proximity does not automatically translate itself into philosophical proximity. In other words, the history of philosophy is not fully determined by, sorry, it's not philosophy of history, but history of philosophy. So the history of philosophy is not fully determined by macro-level cultural factors. First, so this may be one observation. Second, but rather we have some things like counterfactuals and contingencies when we try to write a history. And second, there is an important question which I think was already somehow mentioned by Witold, namely the question of originality. The quest for originality. In this regard, it is worth to draw a comparison between two Hungarians who had some interaction with Husserl, namely Melchior Paládi and Eugen Anyvari. So Paládi, who is probably known to everyone who have ever read Husserl's writings between the logical investigation and the ideas one, because you find that so Paládi visited Germany for 3 years after the war, after the turn of the century, and he was already an established intellectual by then. And he published 2 small books. One of them, called Der Streit der Psychologisten und Formalisten in der modernen Logik, published in 1902, was actually an attack on Husserl. And at least the way Husserl understood it, Paládi was accusing Husserl that Husserl was plagiarizing Bolzano. And then Husserl, 1 year later, in 2003, published a critique of Paládi's book, which is a very rich text in which Husserl formulates the basic tenets of his logical investigations. And if we look at the reaction, contemporaneous German reactions to this text by Husserl, then we find that Alois Riel wrote a letter to Husserl saying that I'm glad, so it's probably quite hard to translate into English or Hungarian. So, Frechheit des ungarischen Strebens nach Gebühr, so was having quite a bad opinion of Paládi. In contrast, if we look at the way Paládi is remembered in Hungarian historiography of Hungarian philosophy, he was actually remembered as a creative mind, being the forerunner of linguistic turn and having revolutionary ideas on space and time. So, in contrast, Eugen Anyvari, who studied at Husserl in Göttingen in winter semester 1909-10, after finishing his studies in Budapest in 2006. So Andrey, by the time he arrived in Göttingen, has published a series of Hungarian papers in phenomenology. Amongst them, he also published a defense of Husserl against Paládi, but unfortunately these papers were in Hungarian. But he really wrote a lot. For example, in 13, he wrote a book on Husserl in Hungarian, which is, I guess, quite early for a book on monograph dedicated to Husserl. He also compiled a bibliography of Bolzano. And when he was, when he spent his time in Göttingen, he got a recommendation from Husserl, which was very positively formulated, that Andrey has captured my particular sympathies. In contrast, in the Hungarian historiography of philosophy, Andrey is mostly remembered as an unoriginal imitator. So let's look quickly into the reasons why Husserl could have had such a good opinion of Andrey, and having a good opinion of his students was not typical of Husserl. So it's really a surprising fact. So when Andrey arrived to Göttingen, he already brought with himself a deep historical background in Bolzano, the Prague School of Brentano. Here you have a small chart of the various references he had to really minor second-level figures. And he was very interested in the phenomenology of meaning. By this is the reason he wrote this refutation of Paládi's critique. And then you have the historical fact that Husserl's discovery of the so-called discovery of the noetical and noematical senses of meaning occurred or peaked around the years 1909-10, and furthermore, this went hand in hand with Husserl's rereading of Bolzano. So we have that somebody with this background in Bolzano and all this stuff arrived to Göttingen. We have no records of his conversations with Husserl, but when anybody leaves, Husserl, or around the time Andrey is in Göttingen, Husserl reaches a breakthrough in his thinking. You can really see it down to the level of the individual manuscripts, and that this is somehow connected to a new reading of Bolzano by Husserl. And then it is, I think it is the question arises whether Andrey has had some part or some contribution to this. So I'm not saying that it was Andrey who discovered this distinction, but what I'm saying is that there was probably a close interaction between Husserl, Andrey, and other persons, and we must study these interactions. Okay. So, because I'm running short on time, I try to summarize my conclusions. So, what I argue for first is a paradigm shift, so to speak, in evaluating the Central and Eastern European contribution to early phenomenology. Namely, instead of looking for creative but unconnected originality and devaluing uncreative reception, I propose that we should look for organic participation. That is, the criteria should be first a level of non-trivial engagement with terminology and conceptual framework, and second, the embeddedness in contemporaneous actor networks. And we should do that even at the price if all figures like Andrey are not central in this network, but they were embedded in this network. And this is a positive thing. And we should, as historians of early phenomenology, we should take care of and we should write about that. And second, I argue for, so to speak, the sophisticated methodology, because I think in order for these contributions to be visible, we should really start employing really sophisticated methodology, historiographical, history writing methodology. For example, we should pay attention to philosophical constellations, that is, the dense and essentially intertwined connection of mutually interacting persons, ideas, theories, problems, and documents. This is something scholars working on German idealism are aware of, but I think that also scholars historians working on early phenomenology should pay more attention to this special form of interaction and try to reconstruct them as far as possible. And then, in turn, we could say that this increased methodological awareness is one potential lesson from writing the regional histories of phenomenology, a lesson we could teach or export to writing the history of universal history of phenomenology, so to speak. And finally, an epilogue. So there are other functions or uses of writing the regional history of phenomenology, which are not primarily philosophical, maybe, but they cannot go unmentioned. First, at least I think so. First, this period was really so many Central and Eastern European participants in early phenomenology suffered during the tragedies of the 20th century, and studying them is at the same time giving voice to these tragedies of history. And it must be mentioned that, at least in Hungary, the historiography of them itself was affected by ideological considerations, and we should try to undo them as far as possible. Second, it must be mentioned that some of those early phenomenologists themselves were not as innocent as we would have wished them being. So, for example, you can see on the slides the marginal note by Ákos Pauler in his copy of Edmund Husserl's Formale und Transzendentale Logik. And you can see it here. And in translation, you find that Pauler writes on the margin that all this is self-contradicting, see Augustine, and then he writes, Jewish over-refinement that is essentially superficial. So it was maybe not as bad as Heidegger in his black notebooks, but this is also something we should remember, and in this sense, we have, so to speak, a responsibility when studying these thinkers, and this responsibility, German used to call this responsibility Vergangenheitsbewältigung, coming to terms with our own history or our past and the tragic aspects of our past, and I simply wasn't able to leave this aspect unmentioned. So I hope I'm within my time frame, and thank you again for your attention. Okay, and questions, comments, please.
Yes.
Petr,
Thank you very much for your paper. And to tell the truth, all these themes for me are new, and all these topics are also for me. In Russia, we don't know this news, and they are not popular, but we don't know about them at all. So all this information was very interesting because it was at first very, very new for me, and I think for many who hear us. So perhaps also a general question for the beginning. Could you please say what the main problems or the main interests are now in the phenomenology in Hungary? I mean, what topics are popular? What topics are in mainstream of the phenomenological movement in Hungary? So what is the popular problems in the phenomenology in Hungary?
You mean popular nowadays or popular?
Yes, nowadays. So I mean contemporary phenomenology.
Yes, yes, I think there is one Hungarian phenomenologist, everybody knows, or there was, namely László Tengely. So he's really was until his tragic death a world famous phenomenologist, and who worked in Hungary until 2001, and then transferred to Germany. The contemporary interest in phenomenology in Hungary is very much influenced by his preferences at the time he left Hungary at the turn of the millennia. And that were Husserl, Heidegger, and the early French, so first wave of post-war French phenomenology, Levinas, Merleau-Ponty. And then when he went to Germany, he developed, it's very simplifying, but so then he developed his interest in new French phenomenology, which is slowly arriving in Hungary, but nowadays still his original preferences are still influential. So, but I mean, it's more or less obvious that when we have such a strong figure in contemporary phenomenological thinking, then you can guess what's happening in Hungary, and this is probably this was the reason why I decided to speak about early reception of early phenomenology, that is before the First World War. And just before I finish my answer, I must mention two other three maybe influential figures nowadays besides Professor Tengely. There are many of them. So, but actually, you have also Professor Balázs Mezei, who is doing, who did work on early phenomenology, the School of Brentano. He also translated Brentano into English, together with Barry Smith. But no, he's working on a phenomenology of religion, or philosophy, speculative philosophy of religion, a very creative, original, and interesting creative foray into phenomenology. Then you should mention that there is a very strong school of early Heidegger in Hungary, which is somehow led by Professor Fehér, focusing on really early Heidegger. It's very interesting hermeneutics as well, Gadamer and early Heidegger. And then, of course, you have those late generation, or not, so those disciples of Lukács, who somehow appropriated phenomenology. For example, Professor Wajda, who wrote to this special issue, so that maybe could give you some information about contemporary Hungarian preferences in phenomenology. I wonder whether this was the kind of reply or answer you were looking for.
Sure, Peter, thank you very much. So I understand that it is also a big question for another report, perhaps, about the contemporary phenomenology in Hungary. So, but our next report will be devoted to Tengely, Professor Tengely, and I think it will be a good connection with your report. So, to continue, so to say, Andrey, Patkul, please, the next paper. Peter, once again, thank you very much for your very interesting talk.
Thank you for being able to.
So, I'm very glad to meet you, even virtually. And I'm so sorry for I do not use any presentation and images, since I try to follow Plato, who said that the philosophers should use images in their reflections and explications, but I'm so sorry. And now in my talk, I'd like to tell a few words about reflection of philosophy of László Tengely's philosophy, basing on the contribution which belong to the issue of horizon studies and phenomenology presented today. So we have in common 3 contributions or 3 articles in this issue dedicated to Laszlo Tengeli's philosophy, namely the ones by Inge Römer, Eren Breuer, and Bence Peter Maroshan. So before I go to the explications of their reception of Tengeli's ideas, I'd like to tell a few words about Tengeli himself, in particular for our Russian colleagues who may know him not well enough, and namely Professor Tengeli was first of all Hungarian and then German philosopher and professor of philosophy, who was born in 1954 in Budapest and passed away suddenly in 2014 in Wuppertal. And in my opinion, in my view, he was one of eminent, of most important phenomenologists. And since I deal also with ontology, with contemporary ontology, I could tell that he was one of most eminent, of important ontologists of nowadays. Notabene, it could be of interest that Tengeli was also here in St. Petersburg and delivered his presentation, his report on the notion of necessary of fact in Aristotle and Husserl during the conference entitled New Concepts in Phenomenology in 2010 here in St. Petersburg. So, and it was a great expression for me to hear him, to understand his ideas, which were very close to my own ideas, to my own approaches in ontology, today's ontology and phenomenological metaphysics. So now I'd like to turn back to our contributions, which belong to the issue presented today. And I like to say in common about these articles. So the first article by Inge Römer entitled in the following way, From Kant to the Problem of Phenomenological Metaphysics in Memory of Laszlo Tengeli. So the contribution of Römer's contribution is elaborated, I would say, in so descriptional way. He describes, I'm so sorry, she describes in general the intellectual on life path of Laszlo Tengeli, but she points also few important questions and concerns with Tengeli's philosophy in common. In general, since she put the question of the possible, so I would express it in the following way. She put the question of the possible unity of Tengeli's thought, of of results, of outcomes of Tengeli's thought, of Tengeli's philosophy, which is doubtful because he, as said, passed away suddenly. And in the first part of his articles, she describes the path, as said, of intellectual life, Tengeli's. which goes from historical philosophical studies in particular of German philosophy and Kant's transcendental philosophy, which goes to later studies in phenomenology, Tengeli studies in phenomenology, and then to the elaboration of the project of the elaboration of Tengeli's own phenomenological metaphysics, phenomenological ontology in his later works. And Tengeli's later works. So the point or the question is how the metaphysics of late Tengeli derive from his earlier historical studies in German philosophy and German idealism and phenomenology. So she explicates the possibility of understanding of Tengeli's metaphysics on the basis of Tengeli's studies in the history of philosophy. But it, in my view, in my opinion, it could explicate also the reasons why Tengeli shapes his own metaphysics, phenomenological metaphysics on this way. But I will tell about this about this problem later in concern with the article of René Breuer. And one more interesting point of Römer's article, in my view, is in his dealing with Tengeli's conversation with today realism presented, for example, by from French philosophers, for example, Alain Badiou and Canton Meillassoux. She reconstructs the argumentation which Tengeli gave to the Meillassoux and Badiou's attacks on the possibility of phenomenological metaphysics and transcendental metaphysics as such. So it is from my point of view, so very important, very intelligent, and good elaborated controversy between today's transcendental philosophy, which is presented by Tengeli, and today's realism. In the second contribution in the first issue of fifth volume of Horizon, this is an article of René Breuer, which is elaborated in German and entitled Faktizität, Notwendigkeit und Zufälligkeit by Aristoteles und Husserl. That's facticity, necessary, and contingency in Aristotle and Husserl. So this is perhaps this is in my own view, my own opinion, private opinion, but I think that is the main correlations, like correlation between facticity and necessary being in Tengeli. This is the main subject, main theme in his philosophical, his metaphysical thought. So Tengeli analyzes the notion of the mentioned notion in two important philosophers in history of philosophy, namely in Aristotle and Husserl, and on the basis of this analysis, he planned to elaborate, and partly he done this, his own metaphysics of phenomenological metaphysics of world project. So, what is the problem in this regard? It depends on traditional opinion, traditional doctrine that a necessary being is always a general being. So Tengeli turns to Aristotelian distinction between I would like to translate Greek and German term on, to on, and das Sein as that which is. In my view, this is the most adequate version of this Greek and German term. So I will use this version of the translation in the following. So as it is a very well known, Aristotle divides various meaning of being, of that which is, and being in the sense of that which is, and there are two meanings which are mentioned by Tengeli in his philosophy, in his metaphysics, and namely these are first of all that which is in general, on katholu, and that which is as God, as on theon, in Aristotle's own words. So if we would think about this distinction, about this differentiation in Aristotle, we could understand that for Aristotle the necessary character, only the being, only that which is as a common one, as katholu, can only have necessary character. But the singular beings, particular beings, particular single that which is, cannot have necessary character. They are contingent in principle, in their principle. So, but what does Aristotle mean here? I think he think about that only essential being, or only essence could be of necessary, and singular individual being could be only factual, and then they could be, or it could be only contingent. So the question arises whether the being of God could be also only contingent, or would be only accidental, so to say. We know that God as such is not essence in common, is not essence in general. God is an individual being. But we could not say, even in Aristotle's view, that God is contingent. God as actual being, in Aristotle's view, have to be already, for all the possibilities, could also exist. Then the actuality of God, in Aristotle's view, should be present before any essential being, before any that which is in the sense of common being. So, thus, the being of God could not be accidental. It could not be contingent on the way. And this is a paradoxal thesis. God is an individual being which should have necessary character. Is an individual being, individual that which is, could have the character of necessity. So this is a problem. But Tengeli finds that the similar problem is in the Husserl's thought, because Husserl's presuppose also some individual beings, some individual that which is in his philosophy, which have the character of necessity. So, and Irena Breuer tells about these moments in Husserl's thought by the construction of Laszlo Tengeli's interpretations of Husserl's metaphysics. Namely, there are four things which have character of necessity in Husserlian philosophy according to Laszlo Tengeli's reconstructions of Husserl's philosophy. Namely, first of all, this is a transcendental ego. This is an individual being, but in thinking in phenomenological way, we cannot tell that we cannot imagine, so to say, any situation in which transcendental ego could not exist at all. This is a paradoxal statement, but even so. The second one, on the other hand, the character of necessity has, no, I'm so sorry, the world in the phenomenological interpretation, the world in phenomenological understanding also has a character of necessity in Husserlian view, but this is, in my view, this is more difficult to explain, this statement of Husserl and Tengeli, but this is of importance that one treat the world also as, in phenomenological sense, the world as a necessity. Being, yes, as necessity, necessary being. So the problem is in the proper, in the own character of this necessity, in accordance to Tengeli and Husserl, because the individual events, the individual beings inside the world are contingent, but world as such, world as totality of phenomena, is in a sense of necessity. So the third thing which are phenomenologically necessary is the phenomenon of the others, of the other persons, of the other people who are also necessary in transcendental sense, not in empirical sense, that we can see from Husserl's Cartesian meditations. So, and the last point, which emphasizes Breuer, is historicity in the sense of Geschichtlichkeit. This is also very strange because history at all always was the things which could not be of necessity, could not be necessary. But the history in this is, in the sense, the historicity is, I would like to tell in this way, a necessary moment, necessary aspect of transcendental life, of transcendental ego itself. So, and on the basis of the reconstruction of Aristotle's and Husserl's views on the correlation of facticity and necessary being and contingency, Tengeli tries to build his own metaphysics, which characterized by him as metaphysics of world projects. Tengeli interprets or treats the metaphysics as, in the Greek word, to agon of world projects, which are of which have character of factual necessity in the sense. So, and finally, I'd like to tell something about Pетр Maroshan's article, and Maroshan tells about more precise point of Laszlo Tengeli's metaphysics, namely he deals with Tengeli's anthropology. So the main notion, the main concept of Tengeli's anthropology, and so far I could know it from Maroshan's article, and from my point of view too, this is a notion of life history, and it depends also on Tengeli's reinterpretation, I would so say, reinterpretation of the common phenomenological, not only phenomenological but idealistic also, notion of event, ereignis or geschehen, in a sense. So Maroshan emphasizes this notion, and he thinks that this is the center of the Laszlo Tengeli's metaphysics, which connected to Tengeli's phenomenological or transcendental ontology, and this anthropology in Maroshan's and my own view has a very is a very perspective, and I think it was a great project to be continued to be developed in a way. So thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you, Andrei, for this presentation. One of the parts of our issue, a special issue devoted to Laszlo Tengeli. Perhaps some questions or remarks from participants? Or perhaps later. We have two more reports, and then we can, at the end of our presentation, so to say, in conclusion, to put all questions that we have. So thank you, Andrei, once again, and I would like to give the floor to Fёdor Станжевский. So please, Fёdor.
My name is Fёdor Stanževský. I'm teaching at the Technological Institute, St. Petersburg. So I was asked just to prepare a very brief report, and so I did. I would like to speak about a figure much less central for phenomenology than those presented before. The personality I would like to speak about is Josef Tischner. a Polish priest and phenomenologist. There are several reasons for which I chose this personality. Well, first, although Tischner's philosophy is not part of my philosophical interests, but nevertheless, I personally attended his lectures, and it's kind of a tribute to this personality, whom I respect greatly, really. Secondly, Tischner, well, in the second period of his thought, Tischner tended to depart from theoretical philosophy to a vision of philosophy as responding to some concrete expectations of people, existential expectations. He was a priest, it was quite understandable. And I suppose that this tendency on his part is quite in line with the global tendency of philosophy, with the so-called practical turn in philosophy, where when practical philosophy is no more considered to be inferior or secondary to theoretical philosophy. So this is the second reason. Well, thirdly, considerations in social ontology, joint activity, joint attention, and collectivity in general are more and more coming to the foreground in philosophy now, in analytical philosophy, first of all. Well, just to mention such names as Searle or Margaret Gilbert, and so on and so on. Raimo Tuomela, of course, in Finland. And I personally participated in a workshop, in a Russian-Finnish workshop devoted to the social ontology, directed also by Raimo Tuomela, a Finnish philosopher. And I'd like to, I'd like to say that even if these studies, analytical studies and scientific studies and cognitivist studies are very, very fruitful in their own way, are very interesting. Nevertheless, I would like to stress that we should keep in mind another possibility of philosophy. Personally, excuse me, just to quote Pope John Paul II, well, who said that the church has two lungs. Well, I'm persuaded that philosophy has two lungs. One of them is the English-speaking philosophy, and the other is, philosophy of phenomenological, direction, line. Okay. So this is the third reason for which I would like to speak about Tischner. I think that his metaphysical or more poetical, if you want, literary philosophy is also what we need. So we should keep in mind both perspectives, both scientific philosophy and more literary philosophy, more poetic philosophy. Tischner, Tischner was a priest. It is a very striking personality. He was a chaplain, a non-official chaplain of the Solidarity movement. And his sermons were widely read and even published, very, very popular. So he had the courage to oppose the communist authorities. But also, after the victory of democracy in Poland, he had the same courage to oppose sometimes the church, now in full power and in full authority. And he remained loyal to many persons who were ostracized by the official church. So it was a very courageous man. It was not only a specialist in philosophy, first of all in phenomenology, but it was also a philosopher à la manière of Mark Aurelius, who lived his philosophy. So Tischner's philosophy can be divided into two periods. During the first period, he was a phenomenologist, a strict phenomenologist. He wrote his thesis under Ingarden's guidance. And his thesis was devoted to one of the central problems in phenomenology, the problem of transcendental ego in Husserl. Then he also had the courage to defend Husserl against Ingarden, because you know, Ingarden reproached Husserl for departing from realism, and Tishner wanted to show that somehow Ingarden misinterpreted Husserl and did not do justice to Husserl. Okay. Then he devoted his his philosophical interest to the axiological problems and to a theory of values, most probably under the influence of Max Scheler. But in the beginning of his second period, he came to review his philosophical interests. He came to get interested in more practical problems. And when asked about the way of existence of values, he tended to answer, I have a quotation. Well, now I'm no more interested in the way of existence of values. For me, what matters for me is the way I exist face to values, the way I realize values, and so on. And he said that we cannot ontologize everything. So he came to see ontology as somehow secondary to metaphysics. Metaphysics, again, à la manière de Levinas. And here the influence of Levinas is absolutely obvious. And now it is the category of drama that comes to the foreground of his thought, instead of values, instead of the ontology of values. Okay, the category of drama. Perhaps now I would rather let him speak for himself, just to quote some fragments of his Phenomenology of Encounter, an essay which marked a turning point in his philosophy. So from now on, I'll be just quoting Tishner, okay? Don't mind. To encounter somebody is to be face to face. Well, I'm translating from Polish live, so excuse me for the lack of fluency or for mistakes. Okay. Thanks to encounters, we achieve some appearance of the face of another person. So, what is the faith? What is face? Sorry, after 16 lectures and seminars a week, my head is a little bit sorry. Okay. So he distinguishes between face and mask and screen. Well, but just to put a long story brief, okay? The mystery of encounter. Okay. No, sorry. No. We cannot say what face is, because face is just some impalpable splendor of light in which the others being is for us. Okay, it's very poetical. It's not strict, but I think that this perspective is really what we need to. We cannot just restrain ourselves to the achievements of positive sciences or some analysis. Okay? So the other is in an encounter. The other persuades, as no object does. The other persuades, and you know, it's recently I ran across a fragment of Adam Smith, who is an outstanding Scottish philosopher and economist. And can you imagine? He speaks in the same line. Unfortunately, I don't have the quotation at hand, but I assure you that you can catch some of this shade of meaning in his thought. Okay, just believe me. Well, I want to be brief because I have a long quotation. I'm going to end by with the following quotation. To encounter another person is by the same token, to encounter myself from an aspect that I did not know before. Okay, I think it's very important, and it's very important to keep this freshness and openness of literary philosophy. Tishner, for example, does not hesitate to quote Tolstoy or Flaubert. Okay, speaking about an encounter between people, for example, he cites he calls the scene between the silent scene between Kitty and Levin in Anna Karenina. I think everybody knows the scene, which I mean. Okay. All right. Well, this is really the final quotation. Okay. So we have discovered two more categories: freedom and truth. The other is free. The other is a carrier of some truth. Everything and all these aspects play a very important role in my experience of the face of the other. Okay, so the other's face is some freedom and some truth, which lives in the splendor of good and in the darkness of evil. All right, I end here.
Thank you, Fёdor, for this very literally poetic and very expressive talk. So perhaps some questions from you, or I mean Witold, Peter, and from other participants as well.
Do you hear me?
Yes, we hear you. Yeah.
Okay. I'm very curious because, as far as I know, Tishner's works are translated into English and German as well, and I'm very curious whether is there any reception of Tishner in Russia?
Well, unfortunately, this is the fourth reason for which I chose Tishner. Exactly, it didn't mention it. Tishner is a philosophical personality who is very little known in Russia, unfortunately, because I think that he is very noteworthy. He's worthy of interest, really. I think that his philosophy cannot be interpreted as just one, one version of Levinas. It's something more.
Okay, thank you. Some remarks, perhaps, how to combine two ways in the philosophy thought. So a good idea. Okay, thank you, Fёdor, once again. And we go to the last report, to the last talk during our presentation. Sветлана Никонова, please, it will be the talk about the phenomenological aesthetics.
Good day, dear colleagues. And I have a presentation. I think you have it. My theme, as you see, is a little bit marginal to our discussion, for it does not exactly concern the phenomenology in Eastern Europe, but one topic in the issue of Horizon was very interesting for me, and it concerned aesthetics. For I specialize not in phenomenology, but in aesthetics, and that's why I was interested in this theme. For last issue of the journal has a section which is called Phenomenology and Aesthetics. And aesthetic problem is represented in this section, but also, which is very interesting, it is represented in the translations. For the part of translations, it has two texts, and both texts are aesthetical. And so we could ask, is it a mere coincidence, or maybe we could find here a sign of deeper interrelation of phenomenology and aesthetics? And so, yes, the second slide. Here you can see the list of the articles devoted to aesthetic problems in the issue. And to make it convenient for Russian-speaking auditor and English-speaking, I present them both in both languages. And so I shall do with the main statements of my report. Yes, we can, if you, I think you see all these articles, and we shall go further. So, phenomenology and aesthetics. This conjunction seems to be ambiguous, for on one hand, we understand that we can look at aesthetics from the point of view of phenomenology, give phenomenological interpretation of aesthetic problems, which are the problems relating some special kind of experience named aesthetic, and also such human practice as art. And that is what is actually done in articles we find in the issue. On the other hand, we can look at phenomenology from the point of view of aesthetics and explore what phenomenological interpretation could give us for understanding of aesthetic problem and notions in general. And this is what we're going to do, to look at phenomenology from the point of view of aesthetics and try to find the place of phenomenology in aesthetic context. So once more, I'd like to ask, is it a coincidence that the translations which we see in this issue from Maurice Geiger and from Mark Richir are concerning aesthetics? The ideas of Maurice Geiger, the philosopher of the beginning of 20th century, seem at first to be accident to his conception, although he is considered to initiate development of phenomenological aesthetics or phenomenological approach to aesthetics. But as we come to Richir, our contemporary, though unfortunately 2 days ago it was a year from his death. It's such an day we have. As we come to Richir, we see that these aesthetic ideas are central to his conception, which should rather be called some kind of aesthetically charged phenomenology. He starts from interpretation of Husserl's notion of fantasy, which in Richir becomes basic for understanding of phenomenology. So we can see the development of phenomenology in direction where the importance of aesthetic interpretation of phenomenological method increases. Aesthetic experience becomes maybe the most fertile ground for understanding this method. And this comes already from Kant's definitions of aesthetic judgment, which he formulated at the very beginning of the development of aesthetics as philosophical discipline. So it's also not surprising that text by Maurice Geiger is devoted to problem raised by Kant. First, it seems he argues with Kant, but then we understand that it's rather an attempt to clarify Kant's thought, to protect it from criticism caused by a misunderstanding of terminology. But we'll return to this theme later. And so let us briefly characterize the main ideas of the texts in their relation to aesthetics and try to reveal general phenomenological understanding of aesthetic problem. See, here is the next slide. Ярослава Выдрова, the first article in this section, Phenomenology and Aesthetics, tells us about intertwining of conceptual basis and world comprehension of phenomenology and such artistic modernist practice as cubism. In general, this thought isn't something new. Both movements arise at the same period and characterize one and the same turn in the history of modernist thought. Vedrova considers theory and practice of Czech phenomenology and Cubism, for the latter was one of the most important Cubist schools. But we can look at it in wider context of modernist art. For example, Ortega y Gasset, in his famous The Dehumanization of Art, says that for all artistic directions of the time, phenomenological vision and liberation of art from everything which is human is characteristic. It's also expressed in conceptual statements of Picasso, who states art turns from recognizable objects to primary forms, from representation to construction. Though Vedrova finds here some traits of voluntarism and manipulation, she also acknowledges that the dominant idea is quite the opposite. We could find it also in the statements of art critic Ernst Gombrich, who says modernist artists turn from representation of the human to the solution of pure artistic problem, different from psychological involvement into picturing of reality. So we can move to the next slide. And so what is the main idea of the article? Vedrova finds it in something which could be described, as she tells in Husserl's term, as uninterested observing. This act is close to phenomenological. Through reduction to pure forms and turn to autonomous image, Cubism reveals the space of phenomenological pure experience. And also you can see here a fragment of the picture of a Czech Cubist, Emil Filler, named The Artist. So they represent here the artist as autonomous image. The next slide. The article by Jan Jossel considers at first quite another problem, the problem of the end of art. He argues with Hegel and Arthur Dante, and insists that from the point of view of phenomenology, this problem can be easily overcome, the problem of the end of art. Though maybe Hegel's and Dante's positions are rather simplified here in this article, but the main goal is to demonstrate that phenomenological approach to art moves quite another direction than theirs do. That means Hegel's and Arthur Dante's. Phenomenology looks at art from completely other point of view. It's demonstrated on the example of aesthetics of Jan Patočka, who considers art in relation, as it is quoted in the article, to phenomenological conception of truth conceived as aletheia. As the author insists, Patočka interprets the art as human practice that allows being manifests itself in art. And also he insists that it manifests itself historically from definite conditions of life and definite epoch, even if it is technical epoch. And that's why even contemporary experiments, though they do not express some objective appearance of things and not reveal truth of the subject as in Hegel, or do not make exact copies of things, nevertheless deal with the truth of epoch in some very special act. And so what's this act? A specific trait of art which allows it to reveal the truth conceived as aletheia is its ability to disinterested observing. Once again, disinterested observing. And once again, this act eliminates the involvement into human context, as Ortega y Gasset told. And as such practice, for Patočka, art becomes liberating and freeing practice. So the next slide. And here we can notice interesting fact. This phenomenological idea is standing apart from interpretation of art as a step in the history of subjective vision, as in Hegel's philosophy of art, where it actually comes to its end, and we can see this end in some such artifacts as, for example, something like Black Square. And so this phenomenological idea, which stands apart this Hegel's interpretation, coincides with one else interpretation, which isn't often mentioned in phenomenological context. This is understanding of art by Arthur Schopenhauer, whose interpretation is also not consistent to common philosophical view on art as specific creative activity of human subjectivity, which was expressed by Hegel. Schopenhauer also sees in art something liberating from tyranny of the will. And it's important that Schopenhauer based that idea on Kant's conception of aesthetic disinterestedness. Once again, aesthetic disinterestedness. Phenomenology turns the same idea into the foundation of its method, not meaning aesthetics, not mentioning aesthetics at all, and then returns to interpretation of aesthetics again from this idea turned into method. So now we'll come to the translations. And the next slide. The first text is one by Moritz Geiger. Its goal, as we already told, is to overcome terminological ambiguity in Kant. And the ambiguous notion is this very notion we mentioned above, the notion of aesthetic disinterestedness. He makes it by distinguishing the notion of interested and disinterested interest. He noticed that aesthetic judgment is made on the ground of intensive experience, which can't be called the lack of interest, but at the same time being very intensive. At the same time, it's free from interest to any external reasons or relations in which the object of aesthetic judgment is involved. And so our theses are: the concept of aesthetic judgment in Kant's system is purest manifestation of critical act in self. And so here it becomes actually some kind of phenomenological act. So maybe the next slide we need. Phenomenological understanding of art is revealing the truth of being. Phenomenological understanding of art as revealing the truth of being is closely linked with Kant's idea of aesthetic disinterestedness. And it also gives us possibility to analyze the increasing importance of art and aesthetics in contemporary philosophical thought. Aesthetic disinterestedness doesn't exclude intensity of experience. The same as intensity accompanies the experience of revealing of truth conceived as aletheia. And so on we move to Mark Rishir. So the next slide. Mark Rishir analyzes Husserl's concept of fantasy. First of all, he separates it from concept of imagination. We can say so. Imagination tries to give reality to its objects, drives them into context of existence. So imagination makes its object to exist. But fantasy, as Rishir says, fantasizes the absent as the absent. And so in act of fantasy, the subject disappears. For intentional position disappears too. Fantasy for Rishir is a pre-intentional act. It's establishing another reality, which is different to one subjectively perceived. It has another form of temporality. So the next slide. We can see Rishir's interpretation and even his examples are rather close in this fragment, which is published in Horizon. His examples are rather close to existentialist interpretation Sartre once gave to imagination, but the latter interpreted imagination negatively, as elimination of reality by its aesthetic act. And so he saves relation between the imaginary and real. Rishir claims on the reality of absence, transforming the external world of perception, so our common reality, into fantastic nothing. And he characterizes this trait of fantasy as Kantian sublime, aesthetic perception of something endless and unformed, very close to perception of nothingness. Maybe we tried to accent too strong one side of Rishir's idea, but it's interesting that it coincides with some post-structuralist concepts. For example, Derrida, Deleuze, Deman. Derrida's difference sets positive sense to a gap, to absence. And using Deleuze's terms, it gives birth to multiplicity of senses in their variety, which is opposite to negative sense of the difference with the letter E. Difference is just a negative instance, and as a negative instance, it is like non-being, which is, according to Parmenides, non-thinkable. And so we can suggest that post-structuralist conceptions also based on phenomenology. And they move the same direction as phenomenology itself, as we see in Rishir. Though they go in quite other terms and solving quite other problem. Phenomenological act affirming illusory character of the world at the same time is able to make it positive, make illusion positive. And positive in the sense of density, intensity, and presence. It's once again is what Picasso tried to find, eliminating visible forms. And visible forms are visible, phenomenal, and that's why they are illusory. As phenomenal, they are illusory. So eliminating visible forms, we could return to intensive experiencing new world of fantasy as new mythical reality. And that could withdraw us from subjectivist trap of virtuality and derealization, and total aestheticization by developing aestheticization itself, like means of conceiving the truth as aletheia. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Svetlana. Perhaps some questions to this talk and some remarks. Yes, please.
Alexei Kryukov. Svetlana, thank you very much for your interesting talk with a lot of interesting topics you have discussed here. And I would like to return to one thesis of you. You mean that there is a similarity between phenomenological methods and arts in respect of freeing from object as far as I'm concerned from your report, and you have argued with example of cubism. My question is, in some respect, I agree with you, because Husserl and his and the researchers in the phenomenology are trying to find the simplest forms in thinking, and in some respect, we can compare art and phenomenology here. But if I take this your argument and use it, for example, for Descartes' philosophy, it is true too. And my question is, what is especially phenomenological here in this method of trying to compare art and phenomenology? Could you say it shortly and clear? Thank you.
Thank you very much for the question. There's thesis about intertwining of cubism and phenomenology was taken from the article by Yaroslava Vidrova, and I found that it is very similar to what was said by the cubists themselves, the French cubists and many other thinkers of that time. And of course, there is always coincidence between art and philosophy of the epoch. But phenomenologists, and Vidrova shows it, they in their statements, they say something very in their statements they coincide with with the main idea of the cubists tried to express, and they also told about it, and we see it in this work by Ortega y Gasset, which described all the modernist epoch. So if Descartes and the art of his epoch are coinciding, they express one mood, one comprehension of the world, and we can find one and the same comprehension of the world between modernist artists of the beginning of 20th century and philosophers of the same time. And phenomenological method is close to cubism. In what? And that is what was the main thesis of Vidrova, and that is what is the main thesis of all my article, is all my report in whole. This is what is taken from Kant's aesthetics. This is aesthetic disinterestedness. That disinterestedness is coinciding with phenomenological method, which takes the object from the human involvement into psychological context, in cultural context, and all contexts to which we should reduce to make the phenomenological procedure. And that's what also we find in cubism and in statements of cubist artists and all modernist artists in general, as Ortega y Gasset told us.
Thank you. One more questions, perhaps. So then thank you very much, Svetlana. And so our presentation is coming to the end, and I would like to ask somebody in the auditorium, the participants, perhaps to make some remarks on all reports at all, not exactly on the last. So please.
If I may, I would make a small remark, just the presentation of Professor Patkul, and he introduced for Russian colleagues Professor Laszlo Tengeli, and I just just small remark. I think it's a little bit not fair by introducing Professor Tengeli, not saying like introduce him like a big philosopher. It's true, but he was also a very important professor and teacher, especially when we speak about phenomenology in Eastern Europe and worldwide. Professor Tengeli brought so many international PhD researchers, young researchers in phenomenology and philosophy to Wuppertal, and maybe if not a school, but he made us like live being circle of young researchers, and he played a very important role also for Russian young researchers in phenomenology and for researchers from Latin America, for Eastern Europe and worldwide. So I just wanted to make the small remark that he was not only very well known and important phenomenologist, but also a teacher who create maybe even a new wave in studying phenomenology in Germany, but not only by German students, but by international students. And as a professor of the program German and French phenomenology, like Erasmus Mundus, Europhilosophie in Deutschland und Frankreich, as a professor of this program, he also played an important part of bringing the phenomenological impulse in Eastern Europe and worldwide. So, just.
Thank you, Dasha, for this remark. And one more, perhaps. Okay, then I would like to thank once again Witold and Peter that you were with us during these 2 hours, more than 2 hours together. And I'm very much looking forward to continue our cooperation in the future. And so we see that there are so many questions and problems which are to discuss in the future. So a big potential of the phenomenology. And I think that I very hope that this third conference next summer in Riga will be held, and we will have the opportunity to discuss some phenomenological issues further. And Witold, do you remember in Gdańsk we've got an idea to devote perhaps this third conference to the phenomenological aesthetics? Yes, that was our idea. Also, and now listening to the last report, I thought that that was perhaps a very good decision to devote some of the further conferences to this topic, so to the phenomenology and aesthetics, or phenomenological aesthetics. Because I don't know how it is in Poland or in Hungary, but in Russia, this topic is absolutely not discovered. So very poor discovered, and so for me it will be very interesting to participate in such kind of conference devoted to this topic. So we see that we have many work in the future, so many problems and many issues to discover. And so thank you once again, Peter. Thank you once again, Witold, for your collaboration with us, for your participating in this presentation. And I would like to thank also everybody who come today in our very cold winter evening. So these people are very brave, I should say. And so I also would like to thank those who was with us during our online presentation, so who was online with us on the YouTube channel. And so the last remark, so the video is being recorded, and so will be uploaded on the YouTube channel, and I will put so this video I will put in our site, website of our journal, and of course I write you especially email when it will be done. Yes, and I'll send you this link to our video, and we can spread this link to other authors of this special issue, so they will have the opportunity to see this presentation and to listen to all these reports we've made here. So thank you once again for everybody, Peter, Witold. I was very glad to see you once again. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.